Schools are usually places of learning, but not all lessons are harmless. Today's story is about corpses, hidden passages, and an obsession with a treasure that never existed. It all began in 1991, when police in Mexico City received a report about the disappearance of Juan Martinez Lopez, a Spanish teacher at Escuela Libertad Secundaria para Niñas. Investigators started tracing his last known steps, trying to map out his movements before he vanished. At first, they suspected that Juan might have run away on his own. Maybe he wasn't kidnapped at all. At that time, Mexico was facing difficult years. Many young people dreamed of leaving for the United States in search of work. At the same time, extremist groups were rising, and police even considered whether one could have secretly joined one of them. But just 3 days later, another report came in, this time from the Guadalajara police. Carlos Ramirez Ortega, a French teacher from the very same school, had also disappeared. And as if that wasn't strange enough, only a day later, police in Mexico City received yet another call. Diego Herrera Gomez, a physical education instructor, had also gone missing. In less than a week, 3 teachers, all from the same school, vanished without a trace. The connection between them was undeniable. The question haunting investigators was chilling. Were these disappearances linked, or was it all just a disturbing coincidence? Within days, Escuela Libertad became the center of rumors, fear, and mystery. Some people began to whisper that the 3 missing teachers had secretly traveled to the Gulf for work. But that theory didn't add up. Their families, not the school, were the ones who reported them missing. And if someone leaves for a better job abroad, they usually share the news happily. Why would they sneak away in silence as if running from something? It simply didn't make sense. The police formed a special investigation team to uncover what had really happened. They focused on the exact timeline of the disappearances, and especially on who saw the teachers before they vanished. When investigators questioned the families, they all gave the same strange detail. Each of the men had been at home as usual, finished with their daily routines when a phone call came. After answering, each one left the house, never to return. That detail was chilling. Juan, Carlos, and Diego were all lured out of their homes by mysterious phone calls. Authorities quickly contacted the Mexican telecommunications company to trace the calls. The discovery shocked them. The 3 calls had all originated from the same place, the school itself. Investigators rushed to Escuela Libertad. Inside, they learned that the entire school had only one working telephone located in the director's office. Suspicion fell immediately on him. The director explained that his office was unique. Unlike other classrooms which could be opened by custodians for cleaning, his office had a single key, kept only by him. If he wasn't present, he sometimes left it with his deputy. He insisted that during the week of the disappearances, he had followed his normal schedule, locked his office, and returned home. Sensing the growing suspicion from investigators, the director quickly added that he had witnesses who could confirm his presence at home after school hours. At this point, the police were certain. The disappearances of the 3 teachers were connected. This was no coincidence. To move forward, investigators needed to understand who these men really were, their personalities, their reputations, and how they treated others. When they interviewed colleagues and people around the school, everyone described the same thing. Juan, Carlos, and Diego were quiet, respectful, and kept to themselves. They never caused trouble, never had conflicts. The school's deputy director added something interesting. The 3 missing teachers were among the very first staff members hired when Escuela Libertad had opened. At the time, this detail seemed unimportant, but it would later prove to be a key piece of the puzzle. Despite extensive investigations, the police found nothing. They distributed photos, descriptions, and ages of the missing men across the country. Yet no trace was ever found, almost as if these teachers had never existed. Rumors quickly began to spread. Some said the men had secretly fled Mexico. Others whispered that they had been involved in drug trafficking, but these were nothing more than wild theories with no evidence. There was, however, one rumor that almost nobody dared to believe because it sounded more like a ghost story than a lead. Locals whispered that the spirit of the school itself had called to the 3 teachers and consumed them, just like what had supposedly happened years earlier to a student. And that right there was the detail the police had ignored, the very clue that tied everything together. Back in the 1980s, tragedy struck Escuela Libertad. A student named Raúl Mendoza was found dead in the schoolyard. The entire campus awoke to the horror of his lifeless body lying there. Investigations went on for weeks, but in the end, the police ruled it as suicide. Yet one haunting question remained: why would a young student choose to end his life inside the school and not anywhere else? The case left scars. The school was shut down for 2 years, and when it reopened, half its students had left. Parents were afraid, and the community whispered dark things about the place. Rumors of curses and hauntings spread like wildfire. An unexplained suicide in a school during the 1980s, something people in Mexico were not used to hearing about. Naturally, they turned to other explanations: ghost stories, supernatural whispers, tales of a cursed building. But the chilling question still hung in the air. Was the school truly haunted, or was it all just a series of coincidences? To find the roots of this story, we have to go even further back, to 1927, during Mexico's aristocratic era. A wealthy family led by Don Alejandro Alvarez had returned from France. He came back with his French wife Rosa and their daughter Valeria after inheriting his father's fortune. Don Alejandro chose a quiet district in Mexico City as the site for his dream villa. He hired Italian architects to bring his vision to life. When it was finished, he named it La Esmeralda because its design reminded him of the Moorish palaces of Andalusia. The villa quickly became a gathering place for the elite. Lavish parties, cultural salons, and intellectual discussions filled its halls. But behind the luxury, darker stories emerged. Rumors spread that Don Alejandro indulged heavily in alcohol and gambling. Worse, it was whispered that his vices made him cruel toward his wife and daughter. Then came the most horrifying event of all. One night, Don Alejandro Alvarez led his 9-year-old daughter, Valeria, into the basement of La Esmeralda. For a full week, the child vanished, her mother searching desperately through every corner of the villa. Finally, Alejandro broke down and confessed he had murdered his own daughter in that basement. When he was arrested, his explanation was chilling. He claimed that voices in his head had demanded the sacrifice of his little girl. The courts sentenced him to death. But the mystery deepened when his relatives discovered that all of Alejandro's fortune was gone. His bank accounts were empty, his lands and estates had been sold in secret. The only thing that remained was the cursed villa. His wife Rosa, shattered by grief and unable to stay in the country where her daughter had been killed, left Mexico forever. From then on, rumors began to spread. People whispered that Don Alejandro had converted all his wealth into gold and hidden it beneath the villa's basement. That was why he spent countless hours down there alone with his secrets. The legend of the treasure attracted thieves and fortune seekers, but according to locals, none of them ever succeeded. Those who tried to enter the villa were later found dead near its gates, or disappeared entirely, never to return. With every new story, La Esmeralda became darker, its name forever tied to tragedy and greed. Finally, Alejandro's surviving relatives decided to rid themselves of the cursed property. They sold the villa. After the villa was sold, it passed into the hands of a Syrian businessman named Fares Nassar. He never actually lived there, but he tried to renovate the property. In 1942, during World War II, Nassar rented the villa to British soldiers stationed in Mexico. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a temporary housing arrangement. But soon the soldiers began telling strange stories. They claimed that at night they often saw a little girl running through the garden or heard voices echoing from the basement. One night, their fears became real. A soldier named Henry Collins was found dead in the basement under disturbing circumstances. The official report listed it as a suicide, with no signs of foul play. And yes, archives show that many soldiers during the war suffered from psychological stress. But if Henry's death really was suicide, how do we explain the countless other stories, unanswered and unexplained? Eventually, the villa was returned to Fares Nassar's family. But by then, the rumors had grown darker. Locals swore they could see the spirits of the dead inside the house. Others said that anyone who passed by at night would hear voices calling them inside, tempting them to search for the hidden treasure beneath the villa. No one dared to live there. For 7 long years, La Esmeralda stood abandoned, feared by all. Then the government stepped in. Officials approached Nassar with an offer, and he sold the property without hesitation. Soon after, the villa was handed over to the Ministry of Education and transformed into a school. In 1956, Escuela Libertad officially opened its doors. It was a boarding school run by a strict headmistress of Armenian origin who had lived in Mexico her entire life. The school became known for discipline and excellence, and over time, people began to forget the villa's cursed past. But as history had already shown, every time the stories began to fade, something strange would happen again. The rumors returned once again. It began with strange complaints from the youngest students. Some of the little girls claimed that at night they heard voices calling their names, keeping them awake in terror. They spoke about it innocently, with no idea of the fear their words carried. One child went further. She told her parents she had made a new friend at the school, a girl named Valeria. But the disturbing part, Valeria had told her that she was already dead. Days later, that same child fell into a sudden, unexplained coma. When she finally woke up, she told her family that Valeria had tried to take her to stay with her. Horrified, her parents pulled her from the school immediately. Then came another tragedy. The headmistress herself was found dead, what the police called suicide, in her own home. This shocked everyone who knew her. She was deeply religious, devoted, and respected. Few believed she could ever take her own life, but her private journals revealed otherwise. She had written of crushing loneliness, of hearing voices, of a dark, oppressive energy inside the school. Most chilling of all, she described seeing a little girl standing silently in the corner of her bedroom at night. The school closed temporarily but reopened under a new name, Escuela Libertad. It housed all three levels, elementary, middle, and high school. For a while, everything seemed calm. The horrors were forgotten. Until the 1980s, when Raul Mendoza's suicide shook the school again. And from there, the pattern never truly stopped. Strange events, dark whispers, teachers vanishing into thin air. Now, looking at the long and twisted history of Escuela Libertad, the question remains, is it just coincidence? Or is the school truly home to restless spirits that will never let the living escape? But if you look closely, there's one detail that can't be ignored. Everyone who had ever lived in or worked at the villa, even back when it was still a mansion, showed signs of psychological distress. The student who took his own life, records revealed he had been bullied, so maybe there were logical explanations. And yet, the voices people heard, the little girl they claimed to see, those were things no one could ever truly explain away. The real question remained, were the disappearances of the three teachers the result of something supernatural or the work of a human hand? That question wouldn't stay unanswered for long. 6 months after Juan, Carlos, and Diego went missing, the school had scheduled renovations during the summer break. Part of the school grounds had begun to sink, so engineers and workers were called in. One of them, Miguel Ismael, was inspecting the weakened soil when workers suddenly broke through to a hollow space beneath the school. What they found was shocking, the entrance to an underground tunnel. Miguel hesitated to enter alone. The school administration was alerted, and soon the police arrived, bringing forensic specialists with them. When the workers finally descended into the tunnel with flashlights, minutes later their terrified screams echoed back up. One of them stumbled out, pale and trembling, gasping, "There are bodies down there!" The police moved in and confirmed the horrifying discovery. Inside the tunnel lay 3 corpses. They were carefully brought up and identified. As expected, they were the missing teachers, Juan, Carlos, and Diego. The cause of death was brutal and clear. All 3 had been struck from behind, their skulls crushed by the blow of an axe. Their remains were handed back to their grieving families. And with that, the mystery of the missing teachers seemed solved. But one question lingers even now. Were they killed by human greed or by the curse of La Esmeralda itself? The 3 teachers were buried and the investigation widened. But police noticed something strange. The school's janitor, Marcos Herrera, hadn't been seen since the last day of exams. Suspicion grew. The police asked the principal to call him in, but the principal admitted he had already tried. Marcos was supposed to return during the renovation works, yet he never showed up. That absence only deepened the suspicion. A week later, Marcos finally appeared before investigators. He denied knowing anything about the missing teachers, but his nervous answers raised more questions than they solved. The police searched his small room inside the school. His wardrobe was locked. When asked for the key, Marcos claimed it only held his clothes. Unconvinced, the police forced it open. Inside, they found the teachers' clothes, belonging to Juan, Carlos, and Diego, and an axe. Faced with the evidence, Marcos broke down. He confessed to murdering the 3 men. The revelation stunned everyone, but the most disturbing part wasn't the crime itself. It was his motive. Marcos explained that ever since he had started working at Escuela Libertad, he'd been obsessed with the legends. A man in the neighborhood had told him the story. The wealthy aristocrat Don Alejandro, who had once lived in the villa, had sold off all his properties and converted his fortune into gold, hiding it beneath the school. Marcos believed the teachers knew the secret. He was convinced they were standing between him and the treasure. So, driven by greed and perhaps by the whispers of the villa itself, he murdered them one by one. That was when Marcos Herrera's obsession with the treasure turned deadly. He had begun digging secretly in the schoolyard, starting far from the main buildings to avoid suspicion. To his shock, he discovered an old tunnel already buried beneath the ground. The passage was half collapsed and needed heavy clearing. Marcos even claimed he found a sealed chamber deeper inside, proof to him that the gold was real. From the first night he entered the tunnels, Marcos said he heard voices echoing in the darkness, urging him on. Convinced that the treasure was his destiny, he continued the work at night. To remove the dirt before morning, he used a cart and hired drivers to haul it away. But then, one evening, Juan Martinez spotted him and grew suspicious. Within days, all three teachers, Juan, Carlos, and Diego, confronted Marcos. They told him they knew something was going on. They warned him. If he was stealing from the school, he should stop, and they promised not to expose him. Instead of calming him, this only fueled Marcos's paranoia. He believed the teachers were standing between him and the treasure. When they threatened to report him to the principal, Marcos decided he had no choice. He made a copy of the director's office key. Then, one by one, he lured the teachers into the school at night. First Juan, then Carlos, then Diego. Each time Marcos struck them from behind with an axe and dragged their bodies into the tunnels. He had planned to dispose of the corpses in the river later, but when their families reported them missing so quickly, he panicked. He sealed the tunnel entrance and carried on as if nothing had happened, waiting for suspicion to fade. In his twisted mind, Marcos believed the treasure was his right, that he was the rightful heir, guided by the whispers in the darkness. His lawyer tried to use insanity as a defense, pointing to the voices he claimed to hear, but after psychological examinations, the court ruled him sane. Marcos was sentenced to death and executed in early 1992. The school was closed once more, yet even after his death, people passing by at night reported strange sounds, the echoes of digging, the faint chatter of students as if classes were still in session. And now, decades later, rumors say the government plans to renovate the building again and reopen Escuela Libertad. The question is, will history repeat itself?